theory definitely does not explain the South Tower. However, just as FEMA did not bother to explain what happened to Building 7, FEMA did not bother to explain what happened to the South Tower. The towers did not simply fall down or break into pieces. Rather, as jets of dust flew out the windows at extreme velocity, that portion of the building disintegrated. Dust was thrown hundreds of feet. When it was over, it was difficult to find anything resembling office furniture, chunks of concrete, human bodies, or large pieces of the steel frame. The towers had steel frames. They were not steel-reinforced concrete structures. The concrete was used only as a flooring material. Somehow, virtually all of the beams broke apart into short sections. Only a few steel beams that were along the outside of the tower remained connected together, such as these. Here are two steel columns that are still connected together by steel plates. These columns were along the outside of the tower. This assembly was also along the outside of the tower. It shows damage, but the steel parts held together. How could only a few assemblies along the outside be strong enough to survive the collapse? A closer view of the rubble makes it look as if the towers were put through a giant shredding machine. What happened to all of the office furniture? Where are the elevators? What about the staircases? The concrete, office furniture, and people disintegrated into such tiny pieces that the firemen were scooping them up with buckets. Only the thick pieces of steel survived the collapse. Nearby buildings look as if they were decorated with tinsel. The shiny objects are pieces of the aluminum coverings from the outer columns of the towers. The aluminum coverings were shredded into pieces and blown up to several hundred feet away. In this photo, the sunlight reflects from the pieces of aluminum, making them more visible. How can buildings made of massive steel beams and thick steel plates shred themselves into pieces? This is as ridiculous as an automobile crashing into a wall and then shredding itself into pieces. Buildings and cars are made of a low-carbon steel, and this type of steel simply does not behave in this manner. This type of steel bends. It does not shatter into pieces. There should be large, twisted pieces of steel assemblies in this rubble. Perhaps you wonder if the beams in the World Trade Center were thin and delicate, and that the fire destroyed the towers because the stupid architects did not make the beams strong enough. However, architects always give a building more strength than it needs in order to provide a margin of safety. The towers withstood storms for decades, and there was never any sign that reinforcements were needed. These two rectangular columns ran up the center of the towers. They are usually referred to as core columns because they were in the center of the towers. Each tower had 47 of these core columns. The thickness of the walls in these columns varied from 4 inches at the ground to about 1/4 inch at the very top of the tower. The columns in this photo are about 2 inches thick, so they were somewhere near the middle of the tower. This photo shows both a rectangular core column and some square exterior columns. There were 236 of these square columns running up the exterior of each tower. Every floor was a mesh of steel trusses. There were 2 sets of trusses crisscrossing each other to form a rectangular grid. This diagram shows only one set of trusses. The missing set would be traveling left to right in this diagram. The purple lines along the right side show the orientation and location of the missing trusses. Corrugated steel pans were attached to the top of the trusses. concrete was poured into these pans to form strong, flat, and fireproof floors. The exterior columns were spaced every meter along the outside of the towers. Windows were placed between the columns. The view in this diagram is looking towards the windows from the core columns. The exterior columns were further strengthened with steel plates. The plates were welded to the columns and then bolted to one another. The plates formed straps around the tower. Since the floors were spaced 12 feet apart, that means this grid of trusses was repeated every 12 feet. The steel straps that wrapped around the tower were also repeated every 12 feet. As you can imagine, that put a lot of steel in this building. The empty space in the trusses was used for ceiling tiles, electric lights, air conditioning ducts, and other utilities. It is important to realize that the framework of these towers were 100% steel. By comparison, the building in Oklahoma City that Tim McVeigh was accused of destroying had a concrete framework with steel reinforcing rods in the concrete. This is a highly simplified cross-section of the tower. It shows one floor of the tower, looking down onto the concrete floor. There were 47 rectangular columns in the center of the tower, although only 4 are shown in this simple diagram. There were 236 exterior columns, although only 16 are shown. These exterior columns were literally on the outside of the building. Many people assume that these towers disintegrated because they were weak, but there is no evidence for such an accusation. Rather, the photos and the descriptions from the people inside the towers prove that these towers were so incredibly strong that when the airplanes crashed into them, each tower merely swayed a bit in the opposite direction and then swayed back to their normal position. Both towers then remained motionless. People inside the towers felt them tilt, but the movement was so small that neither photos nor video show the tilting. Winter storms caused the towers to shake more than those airplane crashes. How could the towers absorb 80-ton airplanes crashing into them at 400 miles per hour without wobbling enough for us to observe it? Obviously, these towers were incredibly strong. According to the engineering sites that have technical data for these towers, the wind force that these towers had to withstand was greater than the force of those airplanes. In other words, a strong wind put more stress on the towers than those airplanes. So what caused these strong buildings to shatter into pieces? The official explanation is that a fire did it. Since no fire has ever destroyed a steel structure before, how could fire destroy buildings strong enough to handle the crash of an 80-ton airplane? The only difference between the fires in the towers and conventional office fires is that thousands of gallons of jet fuel had splattered inside the towers. Is jet fuel capable of creating some type of monster fire that destroys steel buildings? Let's take a look. This hole was created by Flight 11 when it crashed into the North Tower. This hole is black, not brightly colored with flames from a fire. If a fire destroyed these buildings, why are there so few flames? Why are these holes so black? As I describe more thoroughly in the book, the photos provide evidence that the fires were small. This photo is an example. Let's zoom in for a closer view. There is a woman standing in the hole created by the engine of the airplane, and she is alive. On the floor above her and to her left is a man, although he is more difficult to see. Let's zoom in on that woman. She appears to be wearing white pants and has long hair. There is no sign that her clothes or hair have been burned. It appears that there is another woman lying on the floor and looking over the edge, but the photo does not have enough detail to be certain. These women seem to be looking down at the ground. Some reports say that up to 200 people jumped out of the buildings. These women may be wondering if they were jumping into a giant net that the firemen had set up for them. On the floor above these women and to their left is a man standing in a broken window. The Boeing 767 that hit this tower was a large airplane with about 80 tons of metal, people, and luggage. The plane slammed into the tower at perhaps 400 miles per hour.